Now, speaking of something that a lot of people have been involved in the process with this, including your wife there, it sounds like, John. House Bill 710, Idaho's latest attempt to remove harmful library materials. So, for those who have listened to the show or are involved in Idaho politics, you might remember House Bill 314, put forward by Jaron Crane, which aimed to amend existing law to prohibit certain materials from being promoted, given, or made available to minors by a school or public library. It barely passed the Idaho House and easily passed the Senate, but it ended up getting vetoed by Governor Little, which they tried to get back together to overturn that veto, but they couldn't get the proper majority. They were like 1 to 2 votes short, which is frustrating. Anywho, the main concern that he cited concerning the bill was related to how it was ambiguous or could lead to unintended consequences for libraries and their patrons, and could increase the cost for local libraries due to fines. Well, this session, Representative Jaron Crane's new bill aims to take another shot at getting the legislation passed related to explicit material in public/school libraries. After several failed bills that have attempted to regulate and set down rules for what public libraries can and cannot display to minors, the hope is that House Bill 710 will be able to achieve the goals that its proponents want, setting a moral rule for what is allowed to be shown, and solving the concerns that the governor and others have had about the overreach on free speech, and stressing libraries about untold dues and other things. Which, before we get into this, we need to compare the two bills to learn from those mistakes, because you don't try to do the same thing twice, because it usually doesn't go well. If you didn't get through the wall the first time in the way you did, you should probably think about it a different way. So let's kind of look here first at the differences, and if you could point those out for us, John.
Yeah, so first off, both bills aim to amend Section 18-1514 of the Idaho Code to define terms related to obscene materials and harmful content for minors. The definitions provided in both bills are terms such as minor, nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, and others. They're largely similar, aiming to establish a legal framework for identifying material that are not suitable for minors. And second, they both have in common that they use what is called the Miller test, a pronged test that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled determines whether a speech or expression can be labeled as obscene and thus not protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So here's the layout of the 3 steps. Whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interests. This prong assesses whether the material in question has a tendency to excite lustful thoughts or sexual desires in the average person, judged by current societal norms. The second one is whether the work depicts or describes, in a patently offensive way, sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law. So that part of the test examines whether the material portrays sexual activities or bodily functions in a manner that is blatantly offensive to the established standards of decency in the community. And then the third part of that is whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literacy, artistic, political, or scientific value. This final prong evaluates the material's value beyond mere titillation or offense, considering whether it contributes meaningfully to the discourse in any significant area of human endeavor. So House Bill 314, it allowed any minor who obtains material or a parent or legal guardian whose child obtained material in violation of the act to have a cause of action against the institution, the school or public library, if employees or agents of the institution gave or made available material harmful to minors. It allowed for the recovery of $2,500 in statutory damages, as well as actual damages and any other relief available by law, including injunctive relief. But now House Bill 710, so this also provides a cause of action, but it introduces a requirement for written notice to the school or public library asking for the relocation of such material to a section designed for adults only within 30 days of receipt of the written notice. If the institution fails to relocate the material after this period, then a cause of action can be brought. However, the statutory damages recoverable under HB 710 are reduced to $250. Furthermore, 710 introduces a new provision not found in 314, requiring each school and public library to have a readily accessible form allowing a person to request a review of material the person considers to be harmful to minors. The form must contain the definition of harmful to minors as provided in section 18-1514 of the Idaho Code. This addition suggests an attempt to formalize the process for challenging materials before legal action can be taken.
Right. So not going too deep into the weeds, but I do want to quickly recap for those that haven't heard me and John's position on this. It's a topic that in Idaho politics has been talked to death as much as it is an important topic. Do not get me wrong. It is important. And I'm really glad that Mr. Crane is staying on it. But giving a quick recap for those that haven't, the first prong that kind of sits on this that me and John agree on is an objective right and wrong. If we agree that there's a right and wrong, we should be able to agree that there is information, images, or material that are right and those that are then wrong. Because if we believe there are objective standards, we should be able to divide between which is which. Now, are we always going to get that right? No. We believe that we're flawed human beings. We don't live in a perfect world. But in the pursuit, we should still try to pursue to remove that which is wrong and keep that which is right. And so we can at least, at the bare minimum, on these issues that are harder maybe to define, I give harder with air quotations, that it shouldn't be exposed to minors. That it's one thing for an adult, it's another thing for a minor that's developing. They don't have a full perspective of the world that they're looking at. They haven't quite developed or solidified the position they want to come from. And thus, there should be extra protections. And also with minors, they don't have the exact same representation that an adult gets in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because they're a minor. They are underneath their parents' authority and stewardship. And that's kind of where the crux of this is coming in. Certain people think that transgender content, we'll put it that way, should be available to consume, and to restrict it is a restriction of free speech.
It's not just transgender. There's a lot of different content that gets talked about. There was actually, I think it was a 60 Minutes report that came out where they interviewed some ladies who were a part of a group trying to stop these materials. And if you haven't watched that, it was a really interesting segment. But the more interesting thing was the gaslighting that went on around it. It was like a 2-hour interview, and 60 Minutes aired like 5 minutes of it, or maybe 10 or 15 minutes of it.
I hate that.
And right. Well, and they edited it in such a way to make these ladies seem crazy. And they did it very effectively in the 60-minute interview. They seemed crazy, but you look at the transcript, because the gals recorded the whole thing and then provided that transcript, and they went to Twitter with it. And they had some solid points. A lot of what we're talking about here, like, do you want your children reading and looking at pornography when they're 6 to 12? And a lot of us would say, no, my children don't need to be dealing with that at that age. That's not even that doesn't need to be a part of their thought process. So not just trans stuff, although that is a part of the whole thing, but there's a whole deviant nature that is being, pushed right now by society.
Yeah, we should write laws that promote good and write laws that prevent bad. That's an issue that the libertarians have in that corner, but that we won't step too much into that.
That promote good and punish evil.
Right. Which, even if you live on that camp where you're wanting the most limited government, we should at least have that. Laws that try to keep the cohesiveness of society. That if we believe that human beings aren't inherently good, that we're evil and we're sinful and we make errors, and as the scripture would say, we're desperately wicked above all things, we need laws to help restrain that and to keep order so that you can even have commerce and be fluent in society. This is just another area of saying, hey, no, that doesn't need to be there for minors. And also, the other prong I wanted to give on this is this we've talked about in the past about taxpayer dollars. If the taxpayer says, I don't want my money going to that, the taxpayer perfectly has that right. There are strings attached to that money because it is public money, and those strings are the wishes of the taxpayer base. So if the taxpayer base is voting people in, like Jaron Crane and other people that are voting for this position, and it gets passed, this isn't a threat to democracy, as some people might cry in that sense. But I would argue also, to clarify there, the point I'm giving, my second point, is superseded by the first one, that what is objectively right and wrong does go above public opinion or the will of the people. Yeah. We're not sitting here and saying that if everyone says it's right, then do it. Because if we say that, we get into a really dangerous place, which I won't name that part of history because it's named too often. That's in the 20th century. But we
Yeah,
are saying
it's very
it is
true.
this hierarchy. Number one, it has to be objective right and wrong, and that the people then have a will upon that objective right and wrong of where their funds do or don't want to go and the society they want to live in. Now, with all that out of the way, is this an improvement or not based on the other one? The original was that the fear that it would create a bounty system, which would strain the school and library system. That's what the governor gave. That's what the people against it were kind of giving on top of the free speech concerns and stuff, which I would argue part of the goal was to put a strain, because it's not hard to just not show explicit materials at libraries. So part of that being a bounty system, that point of it, I'm sorry, I try on the show, and anybody that's listened enough time will know, I try vehemently to try to see the logic on the other side, and I don't see it on that count. You're basically telling me to your face, hey, I don't want you to penalize the thing you want to penalize. Well, we have an issue now. The whole reason of the bill was to say, don't do that, and I'm going to charge you if you do that.
Right. I mean, I guess it makes sense in a certain sense to say we don't want people bringing frivolous lawsuits. And so this would be another instance of we don't want people bringing books where they're not, I don't know, where it's not clear that they do meet those requirements. And then you constantly start that process. And now you have a backlog and people have to be dealing with this all the time. And it's just getting frustrating over and over again and yada, yada, yada. And so I can understand the desire to streamline the process a little bit and say, look, that we don't want to make our schools librarians' lives that much more difficult than they need to be, because we're incentivizing people to take whatever material they can and present it as being wrong and bad and needed to be covered by this law. So I can understand why someone would say that. It makes a certain amount of sense to me.
I mean, the one counter I have to that personally, from my conviction anyways, is that
Sure.
Go read it, please. Oftentimes people get daunted by looking at bills, but especially when they're amending stuff, you can glance and it'll actually highlight all the areas where they added changes. So if you really want to, you can read the whole thing, but you don't have to. You can scroll to the point there where you're seeing the amendments and changes and read from there. That said, this bill goes on for like a page or two of describing and specifying what is considered harmful.
Yeah.
And like we talked about earlier, that 3-prong test.
Is that Miller
test that the Supreme Court said determined what it labels an expression was seen or not. That's also a part of it, a component of it that's being used. So to that person that's worried about too many lawsuits, too many issues coming against the library, I feel like with that level of definitions, a lot of stuff would be easily and very quickly be able to be thrown out of court.
Right, because it doesn't meet those requirements. Well, that's where you get the whole narrative driving legality, where the supposed don't say gay bill in Florida. Well, the bill never said anything. Those words never showed up anywhere in the bill, but that's what it was labeled as. Looking at the storyline that this bill has taken to get to the point that it's at, I can understand why people are nervous about it and don't want it to happen. But I don't think they understand what the bill is or what it would do.
Right.
And if you truly understand what the bill is and what it would do, then I question your motives when you start when you start saying that you don't actually want this bill. Because I think at that point you're saying that you want children to have their hands on sexually explicit materials from a very young age. And
right. And I mean, on this issue that me and John are talking about, I will say, I think the added wait period thing where it says, hey, they let the library know, please remove that. It gives the library a certain time frame to comply. And it's also a way to settle it before it becomes legal, that there's a proceeding laid out before the court. Now, if the library wants to pick a fight, for lack of a better word, and doesn't remove it or doesn't move it to an adult section or whatever thing you want to call it, right, that's on the library deciding it wants to get into hot water. And also, something I didn't have in my notes, but I realized it as I was recording this. If any of you have ever been down to the Boise Public Library that's in, like, downtown Boise, there's multiple levels. You've got, like, the kids section that's off to the left, and then when you go in, you've got kind of the movie area, and then you can go up another staircase, and there's an entire level for nonfiction. But most people don't actually go up to the third level. The third level, there's a bunch of wooden cases up there. As you can guess, I've been up there for certain things. But you actually have to be accompanied by a librarian, and you have to be 18, if I remember correctly. because there's different legal documents and stuff that you're seeing up there, and they want to make sure that they're kept in good care. The H part, I can't quite remember, but the point I want to give on this is I do remember you did have to have a librarian give you access and take you up there to those things, unless you're in like, there's like a common area that once they get that material for you, you can read without being supervised, which for all those people who are saying that this is going to cost so much for librarians to have a separate section. You already do this, or just don't have explicit material.
Right. It's literally already not an issue.
Anywho, that's an update for you guys out there. That bill is a chugging forward. It has passed through the Idaho House, because it's a House bill. It passed with a 47 in favor and 23 against. So there again, scrape by. Wasn't quite as bad as the original one. It was a little bit of a tighter scrape last time, so this time it actually got through a little bit more easily. So that's encouraging to hear. And we'll see how the Senate moves on it. The key part is if it will be satisfactory for the governor and if he'll try to veto it again or not, because I have a feeling this is going to pass the Senate, because last time it passed the Senate pretty easily. It was the House that was the hookup. But if he vetoes it, then the question will be, can the House and Senate get enough of a majority to override, assuming the governor isn't happy enough with the changes?
Yeah, well, and then that starts bringing into question our governor and the fact that he's vetoing bills multiple years in a row that our legislators are passing.